This is a late 40s Bowser gas pump that Larry and I took on as a project over the summer of 2020. The pump was over at Jolene's garage. It was in pieces and under a 1929 Chevy International AC coupe. It looked like it was torn apart and left for decades. The front and back were dented, creased, and it looked like it had never been the top of a storage pile. The sides were torn away from the frame because the sides were bent up and the screw holes were ripped out with the head still in the frame. And the hardware was so corroded, I'm sure whoever took it apart couldn't get them to come out and just took a pry bar to it. So we looked at this and thought, yeah, looks like fun. So I hauled the outer sheet metal shell to my shop to sandblast it, something I'd never done before, so sandblasting was going to be a new project. And the whole process went pretty well. After a couple of afternoon sessions, the pieces were ready for body work. Now the body work, that's Larry's world. He took the shell pieces in his shop and started hammering on them, bending them, kind of chiropractic for sheet metal. And as he worked, the steel gave it up and moved back into straight and true. After that, we moved on to the bright work, and there were lots and lots of shiny bits to this pump, and almost all of them were dented or bent. And Larry worked these like a jeweler. He hammered and tapped and filed and then handed them off to me, where I would do the grunt work of wet sanding and polishing them. And after this, moved on to some of the inner parts. And the first big clunky one of those was something called a flow indicator. And it was a heavy cast piece with pipe threaded in, holding the cast pieces together. And it would direct the gas flow past a spinning impeller that customers could view and see that the gas was flowing. Because of the mass of this thing, I cut most of it off, and I wanted to keep just the indicator that went behind a little glass dome. So I created a little spiral of LEDs that would go in the place of the impeller. And this is the glass from one of these. So it's pretty disgustingly dirty inside. So I'm thinking about putting an LED array inside of that. It's done. Now it's back to my shop to put on the primer and paint. First primer was an epoxy primer that we put on, and then a little more body work, a little filler putty, and then sanding primer, and then more body work and more filler putty and more primer. And eventually we had it ready for paint. And the paint is auto paint, wanted something that would stand up. So went down to the auto body shop and picked out a cream color and a red color and sprayed it. First time I've sprayed auto paint. It seemed to have come out okay. And the colors seemed to go pretty well, kind of what I had in mind. And got those done, headed off to Larry's shop to set them aside and start working on the frame and the inner parts. With the outside taking shape, it's time to take on the inside pieces, much of which is damaged or missing. The biggest of these is the metering device, or the pump computer. For this, we'll have to fabricate something from scratch. This is one of the very few videos that I took at the time we were working on the pump. And this one is Larry working at the lathe, cutting out discs that we're going to be using for the dial indicators in the metering device. And I thought I would then scan the camera around, take a look at where the pieces are in his shop and what else is laying there. You can see the 32 in the background under a tarp. And then panned on outside, just see what the day looked like. Probably was late afternoon, maybe 5 o'clock, 6 o'clock in the afternoon. And then panning back around towards my place, you'll see the workshop barn here in a second. I'll zoom in on that a little bit, and then wander on back into the shop. So there is my shop in the background. And there's the horse pen where Annie and Ed are. Back into the other door in the workshop by the mill. There's Larry working away at the lathe. So Larry continues working on the lathe, making the dial pieces that we need, and I'm focusing on the mill, working on the housing pieces. The sizing is pretty much set by the stickers that we got for the dials. They determine the diameter, and the front panel determines the spacing, and so the housing was pretty straightforward to set up. The housing frame pieces had to mount to the front stiffener plate, and then it had to find a way to mount it inside of the frame of the gas pump. So it was just a matter of laying out those measurements and cutting metal and getting the thing assembled. Here are a few detail shots showing how we're fastening all the pieces together for final assembly. And Tanner swings by the shop to do some polishing on one of the parts for his cars. These next photos show how fiddly some of the little detail parts are that we needed to make. Almost all the attachment hardware was just rusted and corroded. And some of these bigger ones, we took some straps of brass and made replacement clips. Here on the lathe, you can see we're making some really small, probably for, I can't remember, 1032 screws for mounting some of the bigger pieces of trim. Then here you can see an old mounting plate on the right, and then the new brass ones on the upper left. You can see the threaded studs coming through, and you can see the little Delrin spacer plates. And here is those mounting plates that are installed in one of the corner trim pieces. You can see again the old one that we had to cut off with a cutoff wheel on the left and the replacement one on the right. And then here's what the top of that trim piece looks like. And then in order to mount it, we couldn't just use a nut because we had to have relief that would accommodate that spacer that would come through the panel. So we fabricated those out of some Delrin rod and threaded the end of it so they could thread on, and then put a pocket in there for the standoff that would come through. So here's one just test assembled, and then here's what it looks like on the back of the gas pump housing. And then the last photo is what the trim piece looks like assembled, and it looks pretty good on there. Jillian came by to put the decals in place for us. She had the eye to see really where they should be set, and she had the experience to put them on. And when she was done, they really set off the pump. They are a really nice detail and made a great looking finished product. We're getting down to the last pieces we need, and this pump has a globe on top, and I need to come up with some kind of a collar that would fasten the globe to the top of the pump. So back out to look at scrap aluminum, came up with a piece and set it up on the rotation table in the mill, and spun it around a few times, making a little trim for the outside and a relief for the globe on the inside, and bolted it to the top of the pump housing, and came out pretty good. Polished it up a little bit and made a nice finishing cap for it. Here we are at final assembly. The pump has been put together and taken apart many times over the build process But now we have the finished product, and it looks really great. It was so much fun working with Larry in his shop. Family stopped by many times to see the progress and to chat, and it was an enjoyable way to spend some warm summer afternoons. My thought after completion that this is one of those projects where building it was the reward. I would do it again.